We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 19th of May 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, almost a decade since Britain voted for Brexit, the UK holds its first official summit with the EU. We'll ask, where does everyone begin? Also ahead in the next 60 minutes... The Liberal pro-European mayor of Bucharest is elected as Romania's president, 6 months after the country's first attempt to go to the polls. But does this mean that democracy has done its job, and where does it leave a divided country? We'll also have the results of Portugal's third election in as many years, with the far right making gains. Plus,
as demonstrated by 100 Lights, Melbourne is a hotbed of creativity. It's both self-sustaining and collaborative.
We're at Melbourne Design Week. We'll go through the papers and we'll hear the latest business news from the tech world. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. Israel says it will allow a basic amount of food into Gaza after imposing an all-out blockade since March. The Liberal mayor of Warsaw is on course to win the first round of Poland's presidential election. And the former US President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, in the 9 years since the UK voted to leave the EU, both sides have been at pains to keep their distance. Neither part has felt it necessary, desirable, or indeed politically expedient to reach out too far. But challenges such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought them together in certain areas, and today London welcomes senior EU figures for their first joint summit to help reset things. Well, following a return to the front pages of tassels over fishing rights is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. Good morning, Nina.
Good morning, Emma.
This feels rather nostalgic, doesn't it?
It does indeed. I remember covering the famous Lancaster House speech that Theresa May made 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago, who knows, during the time when Brexit was carefully being unpicked after the UK voted for it. And that was a real shock horror moment for the EU, because remember, she famously threatened to turn the UK into a sort of Singapore on Thames. That didn't come to pass, but obviously there's still been quite a bit of bad blood after successive Conservative governments, threw out their leaders and got tougher and tougher on the issue of Brexit, but achieved less and less. And now this is an opportunity, the EU and the new Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer view, for a reset in relations. But of course, as you can imagine, the dynamic and the context of these reset talks is very, very different to what it was a few years ago.
Indeed. I mean, we'll come to the headlines, which I mentioned a moment ago, where at the moment there are talks going on, or there were talks going on late into the night to try to have something to put on the table that everyone can celebrate this morning. But the context now, do we feel as if the bruises of Brexit have now faded?
It does feel so, yes. And this also feels like this is a win that Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, badly needs at the moment, because his popularity has been plunging and he got a real pummeling from the insurgent far-right party Reform in the recent local elections that took place just a couple of weeks ago in the UK. Traditionally, that far-right party has been a challenger for the Conservative Party's strongholds, but now it's also eaten into Labour's territory as well. And there are local elections taking place in other parts of the UK next year, in places like Scotland and Wales, where Keir Starmer is also very nervous that the Labour Party will again cede ground to this insurgent far-right party Reform that largely campaigns on the issue of immigration. But it's the spin-off of Nigel Farage's Brexit party that used to campaign so hardly on Brexit. So for these reasons, Keir Starmer knows that he can't sign ink on paper on a bad deal. But on the other hand, he has pledged in his manifesto that he would better relationships with Brussels, that he would get growth going. And so that's why he needs this deal.
How much does the European Union need the United Kingdom?
It seems as though they need the UK far less, but as we were saying just before, the context of this warming and thawing of relations is very important, because obviously in 2016, when the UK voted for Brexit and then took many, many years to try and bring that to pass, the United States was a more reliable trading partner, both for the UK and also for the EU. But now each side is being pummeled by the promise of double-digit tariffs, so that's got them all nervous. And, of course, there's a war in Ukraine and real fears that Russia could start to step out of Ukraine and at some point attack NATO territory. And the UK is a crucial security ally for the EU. Remember that it's the only other power in this part of the world, aside from France, that's inside the EU, that has a nuclear deterrent, and the EU, in particular Germany, wants access to that type of power that the UK has. So it seems as though security and defence is probably going to be the low-hanging fruit in these talks, what we're expecting, as per the Financial Times and some other reports that have just percolated throughout the course of the night, that we might see some sort of deal floated on security and defence cooperation that's less contentious. But there are other things that they're going to be talking about on the table too, like more contentiously a youth mobility scheme. The EU really want access to the UK to send their young people to come and work and study and to learn English, because their relationship with America, the other Anglophone country in the world, is souring fast. But that again will raise eyebrows, particularly among people in the UK who are concerned about migration. So it could be an opening, again, as I said, for Nigel Farage's anti-immigration party Reform to, eat away some of Keir Starmer's support if they agree to an unfavourable youth mobility scheme visa, especially if it doesn't come with help from the EU to stop the small boats that are bringing us failed asylum seekers and migrants across the Channel from France and Belgium.
The difficulty that they face is that every step that they make towards each other once again opens up that age-old argument as to why the United Kingdom left in the first place. And you talked about the free movement of people, which is a fundamental, one of the great pillars of the European Union. Yet it cannot be touched by the United Kingdom, because that is why the UK left. One of the areas as well that we're seeing the FT mentioning this morning is haggling, is about fish, and it is that age-old problem that the European Union and the UK has about fishing rights and access to water, and it's something that if you do any EU law, it sort of plagues you for 20 years.
And it's crucial because, as I pointed out, you've got another set of local elections taking place in Scotland, and Scotland has big fisheries, and this will become an increasingly important issue, just as, for instance, the south of England has now become the stronghold of this insurgent far-right party Reform. That's largely because they're being buffeted by small boats bringing migrants across the Channel. Well, Scotland will be very energised if the UK surrenders, they believe, on fishing rights. So as per the eventual Brexit negotiations, when the dust settled on the previous deals, the UK allowed for a time-limited amount of time the EU to gain very favourable access to its fishing waters. The EU wants to continue that for the next 10 years. And so what they've done is they've said, well, if the UK wants a better deal on agriculture and food products, because that's what the UK wants as well, they believe that sort of 80% of phytosanitary products are actually being held up by red tape that's come about post-Brexit. If they want a reciprocal deal, what the EU, according according to the FT, has put on the table has said, well, look, extend those favourable fishing rights to us for the next 10 years, and we'll extend for the next 10 years, or even an open-ended period in the future, better conditions for you to trade your agricultural products with us. But so far, that appears to be one of those bones of contention that is very, very difficult for the Labour Party to square, because it could eat into their future electoral gains, or, their ability to defend their seats in Scotland come this time next year.
We now live in a very different world from when Brexit happened in 2016, insofar as there was no fear of things falling apart, or there was a fearless approach, at least from the United Kingdom, that they said if it all goes wrong, it all goes wrong. A deal was made. But we now live in an era where Donald Trump, the king of the deal, is trying to, sets a tone of win, success and triumph, for him at least. How much has that new American approach rubbed off on those behind closed doors trying to make the EU and the United Kingdom become deal makers?
Well, I think Keir Starmer's in an uncomfortable position, and we've seen this highlighted before, because obviously he's been very, very keen to try and court America to make sure that at least his country doesn't have to contend with the full brunt of sanctions like the EU, which is sort of the bête noire in the White House at the moment, is potentially going to have to deal with. So 20% plus. The UK might get away with 10%. Even if it has its own trade deal with the United States that it, waved in the air, but with very little detail the other day. And so America is trying to get the UK to choose between the EU and the United States. Obviously, the UK's biggest trading relationship is with its neighbours on the other side of the Channel. Keir Starmer knows that. From the EU's point of view, they're very nervous about the UK being encouraged to drop its standards on things like technology, taxing big Silicon Valley powers, preventing under 18s from being targeted by social media companies and so on. They think that if the UK acquiesces to some of these demands from America, then that could be a real problem for them, because they're planning on standing firm on some of these issues. So it's a really tense time, because the EU and the UK, what they want to do is, in those non-contentious areas that are obvious, like security and agriculture and migration, they want to show that they can do something together. But the UK needs to make sure it doesn't alienate Donald Trump as well at the same time.
Nina Dos Santos, thank you as ever for joining me on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. 9:12 in Bucharest, which is where we head now, because a pro-EU Liberal candidate in Romania's presidential election has emerged as the winner. Nicu Jordan, the mayor of Bucharest, beat the right-wing Eurosceptic George Simion. He'd voiced support for Donald Trump. The win for Nicu Jordan is reportedly bigger than many expected. And joining me now from Bucharest is Monocle Radio senior producer Laura Kramer. Good morning, Laura.
Bună dimineața, Emma. How are you?
Very well, and I'm sure lots of sore heads this morning for the rights and the wrong reasons in Romania. It was an enormously surprising vote, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I have to say, it feels like a new start. Romania is ready to put a very ugly election behind it and to look forward. It was a historic night here in Bucharest. There was a huge party actually going out into the early hours in front of the Hotel Cismigiu. That's where Nicu Jordan had the campaign headquarters. And very funnily, it was right across from my hotel. This, by the way, was a very happy accident. We didn't intend it for that to be that way. But in the end, I got a front row seat to the events that all unfolded. And then I had a very quick commute back to my hotel room. So if I wasn't working, I think I would have probably been a little bit annoyed, because there was dancing and cheering still happening at 3:30 in the morning here. A huge moment for Romania and also indeed the European Union. I think there was a really big sigh of relief that Bucharest will really stay the course as a trusted partner in the bloc.
Indeed. I mean, you have the sort of the pro-Ukraine and the pro-liberal, pro-EU mayor of Bucharest pitted against George Simion, who had won the first time. Well, no, right, his predecessor had run the first time round. We're going to have to do the background of this one. But the fact remains is, as they went into the official count, there was a real sense that it was the far right's election to lose, wasn't it? So how did the night sort of turn the tables?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because that's exactly what everybody has said. It's George Simeon has basically lost it himself. He has, by the way, sent a video message congratulating Nicu Jordan on the victory. But there was a point where he said that he was the president of Romania, but that has since stopped. And I think it's because of the very convincing results that came out. All throughout the weekend, we expected a much closer race, but in the end, turnout was around 65%, so the highest since 1996. More than 10 million people, Romanians, voted. And when the exit poll came, I was actually in the park where it happened. It originally put Nicu Jordan at 55% of the vote, and the crowd in the park just erupted in cheers because it felt like a big enough margin that it could carry him through the night to the official vote, which ended up being closer to almost 54%. So actually a very accurate exit poll. There was a worry about how the diaspora vote would go, but by the time that Nicu Jordan had surpassed a million mark in between the votes, it was clear that there was no catching up by George Simeon. And a very interesting last few days of campaigning by George Simeon, because at one point, he wasn't even in the country. He went to Italy, he went to Poland, Belgium. He made a fool of himself on French national TV, embarrassed Romania in a very public way, avoided debates. And it seemed like he was trying to take kind of a note from Donald Trump's style, but for better or for worse, maybe he does not have the Donald's light touch, and he might have done better had he stayed in the country and tried to explain his vision for Romania here.
Tell us a little bit about what you found when you actually went down to, and you spoke to Nicu Jordan before the election results had come in, didn't you?
It was very exciting. Yeah, I went to the campaign headquarters. As I said, it's right across from my hotel room. And it was absolute media frenzy. Everybody was there. I was surprised how easily I got in because they said, "Oh, you're press? Yeah, just go through." I didn't show them anything, but I'm glad they let me in. As you know, because it was an annulled election and there was finding of foreign interference, it was very, very divisive. At points, it also got very ugly. And there are clear divides across large sections of the country that will still need to be addressed. An increasing divide between pro-Western and anti-EU factions in Romania. And at one point, I saw Nicu Jordan being kind of swept away by his security team as he was making his way from the headquarters to go to the park. And it was like this blockade of people. And we made eye contact. He looked at me and he kind of did a little nod. And I said, well, it's now or never. So I had to ask him about this divisive election.
How do you plan to bring the country back together?
It will take time. It will take time.
And this taking time is a big problem now for Romania, isn't it? Because there are celebrations, if you're from the European Union, that it allays fears about Romania's support for Ukraine and closer integration. Nonetheless, there was this very strong voice from the far right. They won the first round of the presidential election in November. That was annulled because of Russian interference. Yet it did actually bring that nationalist far-right spirit right front and centre, didn't it? This is a complicated and very divided situation now for Romania.
Absolutely. Nicu Jordan came in as an independent candidate. He says he wants to bring in new people into politics, have a fresh batch, and see more activism in Romania. And as you said, there was the partying, but now it's about getting back to work, because he's promised to make Romania more prosperous, bring in foreign investment, cut corruption, and usher in this new era. And as you mentioned, there needs to be reform, but in a responsible way. And one of the things they will also need to deal with here is the media literacy, how it happened that so many people were so easily influenced by the Russian bots and everything else that happened with TikTok, the anti-Western narratives that have flourished. It's something that's certainly not unique to Romania, but we see how damaging it could have been here. It'll need to be addressed.
And in the wider context, some people are suggesting that the loss of George Simeon in the election last night was in fact more widely a loss for Russia.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons that Romania historically has been very resistant to Russian influence. It's now experiencing some increased societal fractures. It's being exploited by Russia's tactics. The reality is Romania is growing. Russia probably doesn't like that. There is a significant crack in our society here in Romania. It's ideological, it's social, definitely economic. So it opens it up to vulnerabilities and external manipulation. But this will be including collaboration. This will include, of course, more collaboration now with the EU and Ukraine, rebuilding unity and addressing the poverty education in the country that'll hopefully help combat that in the future.
And how much does last night's or this weekend's vote signify a sort of anti-system election, given the fact that neither of the two final presidential candidates represented any of the main parties that have dominated Romanian politics for decades now?
Well, it's very big. As I said, Nicu Șordan wasn't independent. He's been talking about bringing a fresh aspect into the country, into politics. The economy is first on the minds of many people. And of course, they're very worried about how the local currency was going to react, especially against the euro, the RON here. So the politicians need to realize it's time for reform, to cut the public spending, show respect for the public, grow trust again, and bring down the corruption and show fiscal responsibility. It is a time to realize that the system absolutely needs to be reformed, but it's one of those cases where it's better to do it from inside with trusted partners rather than isolated and outside of it.
Laura Kramer in Bucharest, thank you for joining us on The Globalist. Still to come on today's programme.
If these tariffs come back, for instance, tariffs for Western Balkan countries are expected to increase by 30%. That's quite a substantial rise.
We hear from the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Stay with us on The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS House View, you get the big picture in bite-sized articles, delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts, all focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. UBS, banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Yossi Meckelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House and a regular voice. Good morning, Yossi.
Good morning.
How's the Meckelberg world this morning?
It's good. Obviously, it's early in the morning, but it's sunny out there, so we're all optimistic.
Good. That's. I'm delighted to hear it. Now let's have a look at some of the papers. I mean, you wanted to start with Haaretz. The news breaking overnight or in the last 12 hours is that the Israelis are about to or are saying that they will allow basic food back into Gaza, which is an enormous story, given the fact that there has been an all-out blockade since when? Since March.
Since the big resumption of the war, when Israel violated the ceasefire on 18th of March, they completely blocked, which is, we're talking now, 10 weeks almost of no humanitarian aid. It's not only about food. It's about medicine. It's about everything that, tents. It's also bear in mind that it's, we're talking about sunny here, but it's very sunny there. It gets 30 degrees, 32 degrees in the shade, and considering the devastation, there is not much shade in Gaza right now. So it means humanitarian aid, clean water, sanitation, it's urgent. According to some reports, around a quarter of Gazan population is the verge of starvation, but every single person suffers from food insecurity. So this is good news, but we always question, what does it mean? Limited food, especially in the war, resumption, almost full-blown war overnight.
And this is being seen, just looking at an article from Haaretz that you wanted to bring in, which talks about how these little concessions, well, huge if you are living in Gaza, but from the point of view of Benjamin Netanyahu, this is no great step to make to allow food back into Gaza. Is this being seen as a sort of concessions which try and assuage the United States? Because the United States is very much pushing Israel to come to the table now.
Yeah, as the article said, it's a concession mainly to the United States. But the question where it goes from there, because there are two things basically on the table from Netanyahu's point of view, and they contradict each other. There is the Wittkopf ceasefire framework, which see more hostages release, ceasefire for 2 months probably, and then moving towards the end of war. And then he need to negotiate with the right-wing coalition that were even yesterday against lifting a bit of the humanitarian blockade on Gaza, and said, despite of the pressure in the United States, despite what we hear in the United Nations and evidence of starvation, they will keep doing that, and it depends on them to maintain the coalition, and he will have someone to balance between them.
Forgive me for bringing in what is usually a sort of quite fun thing, the Eurovision Song Contest. But looking at what happened this weekend, I know you didn't watch it, so I'm not going to press you on what you thought of any of the entrants. But the Israeli entrance came second in the popular vote. Yeah. It was an enormously popular song. Can you explain who it is who is sort of pushing Israel so much forward in terms of popular culture? Because it was a big night for them.
Yeah. I managed to see 2 songs there and having dinner, and it was too much. But, beyond that, in Israel, it always, since they entered into the Eurovision Song Contest in 1973 or 4, it's become a big event, not from a musical point, not from artistic, but a political. In Israel, everything, they love us, they hate us. You vote for us, you love us, everyone is hating us. And we know that there is an element of politics in the Eurovision Song Contest, who is voting for what. But the idea that there is a huge discrepancy for the second year running between the judges and the public vote, and reaching the second place seems as a great victory. But yeah, I mean, bear in mind that the singer that sang the song for Israel, she's one of those who was in the Nova party and survived the Nova party in a horrific way there. She saw many people killed in the Nova party. So it's way beyond just a Eurovision Song Contest. It's became something about victory of life over death.
Okay, thank you for that. We needed that explaining. Let's talk about an article that you've spotted in the Financial Times, which is Friedrich Merz has been Chancellor for less than a fortnight, and he's now decided that Germany, and rather Germans, need to up their productivity, pull their socks up, roll their sleeves up, and get back to work.
And the interesting that this article is actually more people work in Germany than ever, but many of them work part-time. I thought about it because we had over the weekend a guest from Germany who works for a huge car manufacturer that I won't mention. And, when he told me about his working condition, it's the envy, I think, of many Brits. Every second Friday free, they have to give another 47 minutes exactly every day for that, but all the other conditions. And because of many Germans will retire by 2035, around 5 million, which means live on pension, won't work, won't be productive. The answer is that though the level of employment is very high in Germany, they work less hours than most people in the OECD country, which is not good enough, especially when you have so many people retired, so many people live longer, and it's not enough to make money. You need the workers themselves, as it says in the article, to build roads and bridges and to do the real work. And this is the kind how you incentivize people, for instance, to move from part-time to full-time. We know one of the issues is always childcare. But childcare is expensive, so it's going to subsidize. So people choose to work part-time. Then it brings to another issue, the issue of migration. Try to limit migration, but there are not enough people to work and to generate wealth. So trying to mix all of it. It's interesting that they mention in the article that actually the new chancellor is the second oldest and is still working at 69, so if he stayed the full time. he will be well into his retirement, so setting a good example of working later in life.
Let us turn to a story looking at Europe from the outside. An article in the New York Times which compares the transport infrastructure policies. I'm not selling this, am I? The transport infrastructure policies of Europe and the United States and how Europe built trains and won.
And I think we in Europe love our trains, and I have 2 for work reason, 2 trip journeys, and I won't even dare to think about driving to these places because it's so pleasant to go on a train. But in the United States, in my visit, especially in the Wild West, when you see all these planes, you think those are perfect for train, and the only trains that you see is basically the haulage trains, very, very, very long train, but with one driver and the rest of its commodities. And there are actually in many places in the United States, going back to the 19th, 20th century, beautiful train station, but they are now restaurants and wedding venues. Now, the question is, what do you do, especially at time of climate change, and the need to reduce drivers and people driving in the United States, that we know the connection, the correlation between the price of petrol and your approval rating as a president. People drive big cars, they drink a lot of petrol or diesel, and there is an issue here. While they don't invest in the infrastructure when it comes to train, while in Europe you see more and more of this, and even the overnight trains that are also very pleasant to get from one place to another.
Yossi Mekelberg, thank you as ever for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson, with the time at 7:30 here in London. A quick summary now of some of the other news headlines from today. Israel says it will allow a basic amount of food into Gaza after imposing an all-encompassing blockade since March. Earlier, Israel began an extensive ground operation as part of its current campaign to defeat Hamas. The Hamas-run health service says all 3 public hospitals in the north have been put out of service. Meanwhile, indirect talks are continuing in Qatar. The Liberal mayor of Warsaw is on course to win the first round of Poland's presidential elections. Exit polls put Rafał Trzaskowski on around 31% of the vote. Mr. Trzaskowski is part of Prime Minister Donald Tusk's Civic Platform Party. And the former US President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer. A spokesman for the former president said that the disease has now spread to his bones. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now let's take a closer look at some of the headlines that we're following here at Midori House in London. Here's Sophie Monaghan-Coombs on the newest museum in Rotterdam.
A new museum devoted to telling stories of migration opened its doors on the south bank of Rotterdam's River Maas on Friday. Designed by mad architects, Phoenix is housed in a gargantuan former warehouse in the Katendrecht district. Itself the scene of a great deal of movement, of goods, people and cultures. But elsewhere, there is also learning worn lightly, soft touches and wit, such as American artist Red Groom's textile New York City bus, in which visitors will be encouraged to sit down and take a ride. It's important that the museum is grounded, the director tells Monocle, and it's essential that people embrace it locally, in addition to being an international museum. Both groups coming and going.
Thank you, Sophie. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. Now, the far right has made gains in Portugal's third snap general election in 3 years. Rising living costs and concerns about health provision has pushed the country further away from the political stability it's enjoyed for decades. Well, joining me now in the studio is Monocle Radio's senior foreign correspondent and executive producer, Carlotta Rebello. Good morning, Carlotta.
Good morning, Emma.
Who won?
Well, there is a clear winner, the AD, which is the coalition between the Social Democrats and the CDS party. They came on top with 86 MPs that were elected, short of a majority, so they have won, but will they be able to govern is still up in the air. Now, you did mention the gains of the far right there, and just to give you a scale of how big this rise has been. 6 years ago, the Chega party, the far-right party, won 1.3% of the vote. Yesterday, they won 23% of the vote. They are now like a complete tie, 58 MPs both for the Chega party and 58 MPs for the Socialist Party, which are usually the main opposition. And we're still waiting for the four MPs that will represent Portuguese diaspora. So those will come in the next week because they come by post. So there's a week delay in terms of those being counted. But if the trend is the same as last year, Chega will get at least 3 of those. So it will be officially the second biggest political force in Portugal.
And we've seen this happen in France. We've seen this happen in Germany in the last couple of months. And we see the right wing hold power in Italy. In Germany a few weeks ago, they'd made a conscious decision to keep the far right out. Is the same thing going to happen in Portugal, or are we going to look at an increasingly loud voice of the far right in Lisbon?
So the sanitary cordon was something that happened the last time around. The numbers don't add up. Even if they want to keep the far right out, it will be really difficult. Now, before the vote last week, I mentioned here on Monocle Radio how, this is the third election in 3 years, and that the most likely outcome was that there would be a repeat sometime soon. And I just don't know how Luís Montenegro, the leader of the Social Democrats, the incumbent prime minister that has now been re-elected, I just don't know how he will be able to govern, because the numbers don't add up for him unless he gets... No, I'm not saying a coalition, but some sort of parliamentary agreement with the far right. And that's a line that until now he said he wasn't going to cross, but we just don't know.
And is this is this the landscape that we look at today? Is this actually what the Portuguese were looking for?
Well, clearly the results show that. I think it has come as a shock to everyone. Not necessarily the fact that PSD won, but the fact that the far right rose so much and that the socialists lost, I think it was around 30 MPs. Now, Portugal, as most nations, has had, despite having a lot of parties, the majority has been a bi-party system where either it would be one of them or the other. And usually the PSD having 86 MPs would mean a resounding victory for the other one. And this is the third worst performance of the socialists since the party was founded. Now, what came as a shock last night is the rise of the far right. This is a party that's very much untested. They haven't really won a lot of mayoral elections. They haven't really proven what they're able to do. And now they are the second biggest political force in the country. We are 51 years on from the end of the dictatorship, from the Carnation Revolution. So there is a real sense of a generational shift of the privilege of being born in democracy, making some forget the ills of yesterday.
Indeed. I mean, and this is the stability that Portugal has already, has been celebrated for the last few years, that it knew its history well enough. It was close enough to its recent history to make sure that it didn't go down that path again. But economic stability, political stability and stability of identity now seem to have all been thrown into the air in Portugal in the last few years.
Absolutely. And, it's one of those things. It's easier for bad news to grab headlines. As we know, Portugal is just the latest to jump on this trend that we've seen across Europe of how the far right and the right gets emboldened. There's been a huge anti-immigration campaign that's been at the ethos of Chega since its founding. But, of course, an increase in immigration prompted by the pandemic, prompted by golden visas, prompted by digital nomads, on top of what they call illegal immigration, has only helped Chega find supporters. Despite Portugal's economy outperforming the EU average, the headlines are, of course, dominated by the fact that most young people cannot afford a home, that the minimum wage is under 900 euros. So there's a lot of structural problems in Portugal, and what the country desperately needs is not another election. We had 3 elections in 3 years. Let's hope that whatever government comes out of this, that they're actually able to govern full term, and that some stability so that can return, so that some of these projects can come to fruition and be seen in their entirety.
Carla Torabello, thank you as ever for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, known as the EBRD, has held its annual meeting and business forum in London, publishing its Regional Economic Prospects report. It announced that economies in which the EBRD invests, growth is projected to slow, standing at 3% in 2025. On Monocle's Tom Webb joined Beata Javorcik, who's the EBRD's chief economist, at their headquarters to find out more.
The EBRD was founded in 1991 with a mission to help former communist countries transition to free markets. Since then, our geographic scope has been expanded to encompass Turkey, some North African countries, as well as Greece. We focus mostly on supporting private sector investments.
And what is the purpose of the meetings here this week?
The purpose of our annual meetings is for governors representing shareholding countries to discuss the future direction of the EBRD and to approve our strategy for the next 5 years.
And it's day one, but you've already been part of a session this morning. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
This morning, we launched our publication, Regional Economic Prospects, which in this publication, we discuss the pressing economic issues of the day, as well as presenting our projections for economic growth in our countries of operations for this year and next year.
And what were the top line findings and predictions?
The turbulence in global markets, as well as heightened economic uncertainty, forced us to downgrade our projections by 0.2 percentage points. And this downgrade comes on top of an earlier downgrade of 0.3 percentage point, which happened in February.
So what are the external factors that have led to this downgrade?
So we downgraded our economic projections for each of our regions of operations. And the external factors are operating particularly through uncertainty about economic policy, particularly trade policy of the United States. Our regions are affected mostly indirectly through weakened performance of the German economy. Germany is expected to register zero growth this year, and that comes after 2 years of German economy shrinking. This weakened performance means lower demand for exports from Eastern Europe, from Turkey, from North Africa. And these are not just exports which are part of supply chains, so it's not only parts and components. These are also exports of anything from food through consumer goods to exports of IT services.
And how much does the performance of the European markets affect the work that you do?
European markets are very important for our regions of operations as export markets. And actually globally, over the last 2 decades, we have seen greater synchronization of business cycles between advanced economies and emerging markets. And our regions of operations are no exceptions. And here in particular, Germany is the most important market.
And what would you say would be the direct impact of US tariffs announced as Liberation Day?
Tariffs, which are binding at the moment, have lowered access of our countries of operations to the US market. If you assume unchanged export composition, the effective tariff has increased from under 2% to above 10%. Now, in terms of the impact on economic performance, this will be particularly felt by 3 countries. By Slovakia, which exports cars to the United States. Here we expect the increase in tariffs to shave off almost 1 percentage point from GDP growth. Jordan is another country that will be affected. Jordan is a host to factories run by major US retailers such as Walmart and Target. Jordan enjoyed free trade agreement with the US, but now it is facing higher tariffs. And as a result, it may see its economic performance to decline by almost half a percentage point. The third most affected country would be Hungary, which exports car parts as well as electronics to the US.
And optimistically, not all areas and all countries have a downgrade. There is some optimistic and positive stories of growth.
Well, all of the regions where we operate have seen a downgrade to the forecast. However, Central Asia is still expected to perform well, growing around 5 percentage points this year. Their growth is driven by export of commodities, by public investment, by rising wages, strong remittances, and tourism.
And these are early days with the tariff announcement. How are you able to hold a meeting when there is so much change on the horizon?
I think we will all have to get used to operating under conditions of heightened uncertainty. And you are right, there is still a lot of uncertainty about tariffs. Tariffs that were announced on the Liberation Day, the reciprocal tariffs, have been suspended for 90 days. If these tariffs come back, they may hit our countries of operations in a substantial way. For instance, tariffs for Western Balkan countries are expected to increase by 30%. That's quite a substantial rise.
And finally, you're all working towards a 5-year strategy. What is the big ambition at the end of this meeting? What do you hope to have achieved by the end of the week?
Our ambition is to improve competitiveness of our countries of operations through our investment, through our support for private sector, and through policy dialogue that opens investment opportunities for us as well as for other investors. And we hope that this competitiveness will be increased through support for renewable energy investment, through enhancing skills of the population, including women and youth, as well as through improvement to governance, both of state-owned enterprises as well as green management of private firms.
That was Beata Javorcik talking to Monocle's Tom Webb. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
There's a craft to every question, which is why at UBS, we query every aspect of the market, working with specialized experts and award-winning research teams, covering over 3,500 stocks in 50 countries, all delivered in a comprehensive library, answering what you want with what you need. UBS, banking is our craft.
The time is 7:47 here in London. Time to talk tech business news. Isabel Hamilton is the UK tech editor at Politico. Good morning, Isabel.
Good morning.
Let's begin with the Data Use and Access Bill, which is making its way through the British parliamentary system, on its way to being law. Sounds quite dry, but actually has implications for lots of people.
Yes, so this is a bill that the government is really keen to push through, partly because getting it through and into law is quite important for a specific bit of kind of wrangling with the EU to do with our data adequacy. But the problem for the government is that there are people in the Lords who basically want to add amendments to this bill to kind of broaden the scope of it. And the biggest one of those amendments is to do with AI and copyright. And the government has really sort of lost the media narrative on this one, because you've got people like Elton John going on Laura Kuenssberg saying that the government's sort of position on AI and copyright is far too weak, and that the Lords need to keep, rebuffing this bill. It's already been ping-ponged back to the Commons once. The Commons then basically sort of kiboshed the amendment, saying that they needed to, the Lords didn't have the ability to add amendments that would basically cost extra money. And now it's back to the Lords this evening, where it's going to go to another vote.
So do we know what kind of bill we will eventually end up with?
Well, the government has a majority, so you would expect it to kind of ping-pong around for a bit and for them to eventually win, but sort of how long that process drags on is quite material to them. Like I said, there's a bit of a deadline on this thing, because the EU needs to decide whether we have data adequacy status, basically whether we protect data well enough to kind of trade with them in the way that they want to by December. We've already had an extension on that deadline, and there's not a lot of parliamentary time between now and December. So there is a bit of a rush.
And when it comes to introducing the Elton John factor, the fact that he starts to talk very openly about, I think he accused the British government of being losers over these plans to exempt technology firms from copyright laws. Will that change anything? Because it suddenly brings things into a much more human and relevant perspective.
So the government's not proposing that we exempt anyone from copyright laws. The problem for them is that they stated that their preferred option for the kind of status of AI firms using copyrighted material was that creators and rights holders opt out. That would mean that if you were a writer or a musician or whoever, then your work would automatically be up for these AI companies to use, unless you use some kind of mechanism to say, actually, no, I'm opting out. But yeah, having Elton John and celebrities kicking up a fuss means that this has hit the headlines in a way that it wouldn't, a piece of tech policy wouldn't normally.
Let's move on to a story about Donald Trump and his trip to the Middle East last week. Opened lots of doors and signed lots of trade deals. Artificial intelligence is a hugely important part of the future of tech and business, isn't it? And this is something that he was trying to capitalise on.
Yes, I think that this is an interesting one geopolitically. It's caused a bit of turmoil in Washington because Trump is offering all these sort of chip sales to Middle Eastern countries, to the UAE. And, the US is meant to be on its own sort of domestic drive. So there's a bit of a question about, well, where does that leave the kind of domestic policy? On top of that, there are Republicans who worry that if you sell lots and lots of chips to the Middle East, then the Middle East might then turn around and sell them on to China. And the US has worked quite hard to put in lots of policies that restrict the export of AI chips specifically to China. And for us as a country, the UK, this is quite demoralizing for the people who are putting the government's AI opportunities plan into force, because the idea there is that we try to become the third biggest AI country behind the US and China. And if the US is handing this huge competitive advantage to the Middle East, then that kind of shunts us down the queue quite a long way.
This is always the way, isn't it? That you briefly, if you don't mind as well, because time's against us. But the fact is that business pushes ahead in one direction and politics pushes back.
Well, I think what's difficult for the UK is we're currently trying to forge this technology partnership with the US, right? It kind of came out in the news about us getting a tariff carve out. And Peter Mandelson is pushing really hard for us to have this partnership with the US on AI. But we do not have that much to offer the US, to be frank. We're a smaller economy. And yeah, there are other geopolitical forces at play.
Isabel Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, the design world's eyes might well be on the Venice Biennale right now, but there's also another significant design festival at the moment, a little further south, in the Australian city of Melbourne. The city's widely seen as Australia's creative and cultural heart, and Melbourne Design Week, beginning last week, features 350 events with exhibitions, workshops, talks, installations. There's even a run club and a golf day. Well, one of the featured events is the exhibition 100 Lights. And Monocle's Canberra correspondent Betty Gary headed to Australia's second city to find out more.
It's the opening of Melbourne Design Week.
Hi, lovely. How are you? Good to see you.
How are you doing here? In just 9 years in existence, the event has become Australia's largest and most prestigious design festival, and is now also starting to gain interest in Asia. The opening at the inner city Meat Market Stables exhibition space is also the launch of one of its key exhibitions called 100 Lights.
Hi, my name is Dale Hardiman. I'm one of the co-organisers of 100 Lights in collaboration with Tom Skean as Friends and Associates. Lighting is quite a popular medium within Melbourne and quite famously a destination for quite a few famous lighting designers. The purpose of the 100 Lights exhibition was to be as inclusive as possible from very early career practitioners all the way through to very established, and to include as many people from across Australia as possible.
So how did you go about putting it together?
At the end of last year, Tom and I came up with the idea for hosting, this is our 13th exhibition together, and so we decided we would organise the biggest show we've ever done in the past 9 years. And so we basically just put out one social media post on Instagram, and then we received just close to 160 expressions of interest to be within the exhibition. And then we had to go through the process of selecting 100 of those lights. The selection process was really tricky because we wanted to include as many people as possible. And the interesting thing for us is that almost 50% of this exhibition we've never heard of the designer before, which is a very good thing that we can include them in the show. It was a matter of looking at their previous bodies of work and the work that they'd put forward and whether or not we believed it suited the overall theme of the exhibition.
What are some of the standouts to you? I know it's really hard to pick favourites.
There's just some really, it's such a broad mix of materials and mediums. So Tantri's work with it's a ginormous ceramic hand-built piece which is fired in a kiln, which would be very stressful. Jonathan Tovum's taken Toyota Corolla headlight and turned that into a floor lamp. There's just a phenomenal... Ruth Allen Glass, along with Adam Markowitz Design, have produced a collaboration where they've slumped glass over timber in the process of making their wall light.
My name is Tantri Mustika and I am a practicing ceramic artist. So this lamp that I have submitted to the 100 Lights exhibition, it's called Flow State Lamp, and it is a large-scale floor lamp. It stands about 160 centimetres tall, and I'm quite short, so it's taller than me. So the biggest piece I've made to date. So it's based off a series of pieces that are threaded onto a steel substrate, and there's a lot of use of my sort of signature hand-stained and marbled clays. So I guess it's a totem-style lamp, and it's got a beautiful silver platinum luster featured in the base and through the shade, and pearls featured on the lampshade. And then the main piece of the lamp, I guess the centerpiece of the lamp, is a hand-carved floral component. I'm definitely mostly in ceramics. Lighting is definitely a bit of a new direction that I'm exploring, and unbeknownst to me, it's quite complicated. It adds a whole other element to the design process and the way that you've got to think about what you're creating. But yeah, I don't know that it's 100% on my radar because I spend a lot of time in my studio on my own. I like to call myself a little bit of a ceramic studio troll.
I'm Beata Javorcik. I'm Adelaide-based designer from Melbourne originally, but working out of the Jam Factory. The work that I produce is at the intersection of art, craft and design, where I try to blend my experience or knowledge within the industrial design and furniture design space to create pieces that kind of blur the lines of both. And then I guess at the heart of that is material exploration. So this piece is titled Athos. It's one of the Three Musketeers, as you might be familiar. So originally there was a smaller version of this piece that was shown for Melbourne Design Week 2023, alongside two other floor lamps as well. Since then, it has developed and progressed into this much larger form that you see here. The material has also changed as well, whereas the original was American walnut. This one is radiata pine. So it's a much lighter hue, much warmer tones. The diffusion of light is also much warmer as well. And the decorative elements of this particular lamp come from the natural curls and folds of the timber that it is made from. And it's made from hand-planed timber shavings as well.
That's incredible, because looking at it, I had no idea it was timber.
Yeah, I've had people think of it being a completely different material as well. And I love being able to make things that look like one thing but are actually another. And it's just a fantastic way of showing what you can do with waste timber, I suppose, because these were originally produced from timber offcuts. So it's good that you can kind of work with them in a way to create such sculptural decorative forms that are reminiscent or connect to other experiences or knowledge that people have.
As demonstrated by 100 Lights, Melbourne is a hotbed of creativity that's both self-sustaining and collaborative. Melbourne Design Week's curator is Timothy Moore, who is also the curator of contemporary design and architecture at the National Gallery of Victoria, which delivers the event.
Yeah, so I think we've seen Melbourne design transform in the last 20 years. So in the early 2000s, we really saw design sector start to produce furniture and products for an architecture and interior design sector. So what you see in Melbourne is, I think, it does echo global trends in dealing with storytelling, but I think there's a really local focus on local stories that you'll see as well. So what you see in Melbourne and Australia is, I think it's really brash and fresh. There's humour, there's a real tension to materiality, but there's also the storytelling is what makes it unique to Australia. And I think Trent Jackson is a perfect example of that as well. I think also we have a keynote by Kennedy Nolan, who I would say they're one of Australia's most celebrated architects living today or practicing today. And they also celebrate Melbourne Australian design. If you've been to their Hotel Melbourne Place, about 80% of the furniture and interiors specify Australian design. So if you go there, you'll see how unique it can be.
And that was Beata Javorcik there, reporting from Melbourne Design Week. It runs until the 25th of May. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers, Monica Lillis, Carlotta Ribello and Chris Chermak. Our researcher was Francesca Gilks and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. I'll be back with the briefing live at midday here in London, and The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.